You're watching BNN Bloomberg. I'm John Ehrlichman, and we're going to continue our conversation now with Roger McNamee, Managing Director at Elevation Partners and also the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. You know, Roger, you were outlining the business model of Facebook, and we're reminded of different platforms having different policies because you have Twitter going in another direction. How would you compare and contrast what their philosophies have been at this time of tension?
John, here's the issue. The business model is essentially identical. Twitter and YouTube, Instagram, all depend on engagement, grabbing our attention, holding it, manipulating, exactly the way Facebook would. Twitter is in an interesting position in that its business was really made by President Trump. And as a consequence, Twitter's dependence on Trump has been even more extreme than Facebook or Instagram or YouTube. So when Twitter came out and made a policy change, initially fact-checking, and then placing safety warnings on some of Trump's tweets that incited violence, that was actually very courageous. I mean, it was hopelessly late, maybe 3 years too late, but nonetheless, very courageous. And it set up a confrontation that caused Trump to issue an executive order challenging the entire industry. At the end of the day, the internet platforms like Facebook have benefited so much from the Trump presidency that one of the challenges they face is how they're going to handle the 2016 election. And I think that Twitter has suggested by its behavior that it's going to try to be a fair broker. Facebook has taken exactly the opposite approach. They've more or less said that they are in the bag for Trump. They've changed policies like their policy on false advertising, specifically to give Trump the ability to do things that no other person on Facebook has been allowed to do. And so that kind of contrast, I think, is going to be one of the biggest political issues of this year in the United States and sets up a challenge for Facebook next year if there's a new administration.
So we'll see what happens in November. You know, Roger, I'd also love to get your perspective on something that's been developing here in Canada, Sidewalk Labs, which is ultimately part of Google's parent company, Alphabet. They decided they would not be proceeding with what people had loosely described as a digital city. But, you know, this was a story, speaking of tensions, this is a story that had tensions as well about, you know, who controls the data. And you had spoken to us extensively about this previously. What was your reaction to the news that Sidewalk will not be involved with this or building out here in Toronto?
John, I broke out the champagne. To me, the thing that was so disturbing about Sidewalk Labs was that Sidewalk and Alphabet had not been transparent about what their intentions were, about what their goals were. And for all intents and purposes, the thing in play was about who would control the community. Would it be, in fact, the normal democratic processes that cities have governed themselves with in Canada for the last couple hundred years, or would it be a corporation like Alphabet? And in this particular context, the Sidewalk Labs program was going to substitute algorithms for democracy in many of the core functions of that community with the explicit goal of trying to expand to all of Toronto. And in my mind, a topic like that requires a really serious debate over a long period of time. It's a very, very, very big change. It's not just about getting data. This is really about people's self-determination. It's about democracy. And Google, you know, whether they admit it or not, they're very focused on gaining economic value through efficiency. And efficiency, while it's great for a small system, is a terrible thing for a community because it runs contrary to self-determination and democracy. So I'm super glad the way it turned out.
Interesting. You know, we've talked a lot about that story in Canada, but increasingly we're talking about this rise of Shopify, which even today has this new partnership with Walmart. I would love to get your take on the rise of Shopify and what message it tells you.
Well, John, the core thing to me is that the pandemic has radically increased the relative advantage of digital shopping systems over retail stores. And Shopify is obviously putting itself in excellent position relative to that change. I don't want to be a detailed commentator because retail's not the thing that I focus on most closely. But the one thing that I'm absolutely certain of is that the mighty relative to the internet world are getting mightier because of the pandemic. It is harming traditional retail so badly that it's just not obvious to me, if this goes on for another year or two, that small stores in Canada or the United States are going to be able to survive long enough to be able to reestablish on the other end. And I don't know what that looks like, because in the United States, at least, Amazon is so dominant in the online shopping world, and it's not clear that that coming out of the pandemic, their position isn't insurmountable.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a way to tie this back to what we first started talking about today, in that Shopify also teaming up with Facebook in a bigger way has created some excitement for their business. And it's a complicated time for brands. Brands in many ways are expected to take a stand, and I wonder if that's a world that's still evolving. Many merchants right now, they go to platforms like Facebook because there's a lot of eyeballs there. But you started this conversation about talking about sometimes the kind of engagement taking place on Facebook that I would think maybe some e-commerce sellers won't feel comfortable. Maybe they don't feel comfortable today, or maybe in the future they won't feel comfortable with all that happening. So how do we navigate that?
It's a super important issue, because in the United States, where I think plainly our political culture is more extreme than Canada's by a lot. In the United States, we're being forced to confront centuries of racism. We're being forced to confront an economy that favored the few over the many, and systems like our healthcare service that were just totally inappropriate for the kind of problems we face in a pandemic. And so the political conversations happening in the United States are happening on social media. So there's goodness going on there. The problem at the end of the day is that it's not really a fair debate, because essentially the algorithmic amplification of hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories gives disproportionate political weight to the most extreme voices in the United States. And that is the environment we live in. So if you're a brand, you're stuck. And I think the reason why brands feel pressure to take a stand right now is that the country's culture, its values are changing. And the question is, are they just changing for the moment, or are they going to change in some substantive way? And some elements of what are going on really do feel different. I mean, the issues of racism and the way the country has confronted its racist past, that does not feel, I'm old enough to remember the 60s, and, it has been since then that, since we last had this kind of a self-assessment. And this is much more severe. What you see at these protests is lots of white people who are there protesting the treatment of people of color. And that didn't happen so much in the 60s. So this is a huge deal. And brands have to get on the right side of that. My basic view is, I hope that they all decide to go to the side of their customers, because that in the long run, I think, will serve them very well.
Roger, always great to get your perspectives. Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure to be on with you. And I just want to wish all my friends in Canada a lovely day. And please stay well, everybody. And don't forget to wear your mask.
Absolutely. Roger, thanks a lot. Roger McNamee, Managing Director of Elevation Partners and the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe.